Hi, welcome to Rob's Mailbag here on SB Nation's YouTube channel. I'm Rob Nyer. I am the national baseball editor for Baseball Nation, SB Nation's baseball page, and I'm going to be answering questions here every week. You can send me your questions at robsmailbag@sbnation.com, and I'll give that address a little later in case you don't like to rewind when you watch video. First question this week. Rob, when scouts, GMs, or baseball writers reference bad makeup as part of a reason a top prospect falls apart, is it a general catch-all phrase meaning second coming of Matt Bush, or are there specific metrics or indicators used to determine this? On the one hand, the way the phrase is used by baseball insiders seems to give the second meaning weight, but from a fan's perspective, it often feels like it's an after-the-fact evaluation that's nearly impossible to properly assign to a player before they actually start competing in the minors. Could you shed some light on this? Thanks, Jeff. Certainly, we're going to try to find explanations after the fact. I think quite often those guys are thought to have at least questionable makeup before they fail as prospects, but that's true of a lot of guys who make it. Curt Schilling, somewhat famously, was, by his own admission, did not really have it together until he was well into his professional career, in the majors, actually. So it's very hard to say. I think that bad makeup can mean he's kind of a bad guy. Maybe he drinks too much. Maybe he doesn't comport himself well on road trips. Or it just means maybe he doesn't really care about baseball enough to work hard at it. And I think that bad makeup is a catch-all for a lot of things. You know, there might be, I know there was I didn't actually read the piece, but it sounded intriguing. Some economist recently published an article suggesting that NFL teams should draft bad makeup guys on purpose. I would assume, again, I didn't read it, but I'm assuming that that's because it's sort of a market inefficiency. Teams pass on guys who are supremely talented because they have bad makeup, and so you can get a great player later in the draft than you otherwise could. Randy Moss perhaps being a prime example, but I'm sure there are many others. And the same may be true in baseball. I think the difference is that Randy Moss was NFL ready from day one. Probably could have played the NFL when he was 19 or 20. That's how talented he was. Whereas baseball players, they need to learn, almost all of them really, except the odd pitcher, college pitcher. They need to learn how to play baseball for a few years in the minors. And if you've got a guy who doesn't really want to get better, who doesn't want to work, he might not develop, quite possibly will not develop. So I think that's where bad makeup really comes in with scouts, is if they think a guy just doesn't care enough to work on his game, to take instruction, that might be a guy you legitimately should pass on in the draft, or at least wait for a while. But, teams know that, and when they take guys, they think it's because they can work with them. So I think you're right that after the fact, it's easy to say the guy has a bad makeup, that's why he failed. Most of those guys, I think they do know beforehand. If they don't, they should. They should work harder at that. Thanks again for the question, Jeff. Next question. This is from Edward. Rob, I was rereading Phil James's historical baseball abstract and marveling at some historical parallels. Is there something in baseball's DNA, market forces or scouting priorities or something else, that makes the like of Tim Raines and Ricky Henderson or Ty Cobb and Tris Speak or George Brett and Mike Schmidt appear at the same time? Is it traceable? Is it worthwhile to trace? If every team is sending back reports on a kid saying, he's the next Gehrig, should I tell my scouts that the next Fox, Jimmy Fox, must also be out there flying under the radar and they need to find him? Again, that question is from Edward. Well, Edward, I think no. I think that for the most part, it's all cyclical. Maybe that's not even the right word. It's random. You're going to have two great first basemen at once, or even three. You had Gehrig and Jimmy Fox and also Hank Greenberg at once. In the 50s, you had Duke Snider and Willie Mays and Mickey Mantle. In the 80s, George Brett and Mike Schmidt. Also later in the 80s, Tim Raines and Ricky Henderson. I think for the most part, it is random. I think in the case of Raines and Henderson, that was a time, the 1980s, when the game was particularly amenable to their particular skills. Stolen bases there wasn't so much power that nobody wanted to steal. There were a lot of artificial turf ballparks, which made it easier to run. Henderson didn't play in an artificial turf ballpark, not for long anyway, but Raines certainly did. I think if those guys had come along in the 50s or 60s, they wouldn't have been the stars that they were, the superstars they were. They would have been great players, but they wouldn't have been quite as great because they wouldn't have stolen as much. This wasn't a speed game. But for the most part, all the other guys, I think it's just a random thing that happened. I remember reading an article in the late 80s, somebody trying to explain why there weren't any great young catchers coming up. And there were all these stupid reasons, video games and young players are lazy. And then within a few years we had Mike Piazza and and Pudge Rodriguez, a couple of Hall of Fame quality catchers. So these things just come around, and there's no particular reason, I don't think anyway. Next question is from Susan. Rob, why no love for my O's, ever? It's a good question. I think that we want to see the O's play a little better than they've played as well as they played. They're 9-7. We want to see them play this well for a while longer before we start to go a little crazy. I mean, and I think a lot of us, myself included, were optimistic about them last year. They had that great second half in 2010. They had Buck Showalter, who I love. They had all those young pitchers, and it just didn't happen. This year, it has happened, especially on the pitching side. The hitting's been real good, too. Matt Wieters has been fantastic, finally becoming the player that we thought he was going to be 2 or 3 years ago. Nolan Reimold's been off the charts. Adam Jones, I mean, up and down the line, aside from Mark Reynolds, who's been terrible, and J.J. Hardy, who's been awful. The hitters have been, Nick Johnson, who's 0 for 23, that's something. But everybody else has been basically outstanding in the lineup. And the pitchers, too. I mean, aside from Tommy Hunter, who struggled because he's given up a ton of home runs, and Brian Mattis has been a disaster after a great spring training, which I did not see coming. I mean, I didn't see the spring training coming, or what he's done in his 3 starts. But Arrieta's been pretty good. Hamill's been pretty good. Wei-Yin Chen, the rookie from Taiwanese, has been excellent. Bullpen's been pretty good. Maybe this is just last year was the blip, and Showalter's got these guys playing like he's had teams playing before. We'll see. I'm guardedly optimistic, but I do think it's too early, and I still think that ultimately the Orioles are going to be successful if their young pitchers are successful, and it's way too early to make that call yet. Next question, Greg writes, Rob, which pitchers are suspected of throwing spitters or pitches of that ilk? Love your writing. Thank you, Greg. This is the only time that I'm going to let someone's question get through because they said they love my writing. I do appreciate it. Don't shy at this at home, though, kids. Well, I don't think anybody is suspected of throwing a spitter these days. It really just doesn't happen anymore. And I believe that it's essentially because there's too much scrutiny. I think that with however many cameras are trained on every single game now, almost every single game, it's just almost impossible to get away with throwing a spitter. I did a Google search, Google News, and there hasn't been one mention in the last month of a spitball in baseball. And I can't remember the last time I heard a pitcher even being mentioned as possibly throwing a spitball. I think there are just too many cameras, too hard to get away with it, and pitchers have a lot more options now, or I shouldn't say they have more options. They seem to have more viable options now with all the different change-ups, the cut fastball. I think it's just sort of been bred out of them. I don't think anybody teaches it anymore. It's not encouraged. But again, I do believe that really what it comes down to is you just can't get away anymore with throwing it. Anything you do, and we saw a few years ago, it wasn't that long ago, pitcher had pine tar on the bill of his cap, and it was a huge controversy. And I think that would happen basically to anybody who tried to do anything, throw a spitball, doctor the ball in any way. It's just too hard to get away with. Last question. This is from Bud's Buddy. I'm not sure if that's his real name, but Bud's Buddy writes, Rob, both the Dodgers and Nationals are off to surprising 12-4 starts. Which of the two is more likely to sustain that success? It's a great question. I think both teams were regarded as having some potential to do well this season, but clearly nobody expected them to do this well. And, they've both been a little lucky. The Dodgers have outscored their opponents by only 10 runs, which is not a huge number. Nationals by 13 runs, also not a huge number. I think in this case, I would simply look at what they've done, look at the individual players, and try to figure out, okay, who's been more out of character? Who's had more players out of character? And I think the answer is probably the Nationals. I look at the Dodgers, and sure, I mean, Matt Kemp is doing what he's doing is unsustainable. 9 home runs in 16 games. He can't keep doing that, clearly. But, otherwise, I don't see a lot of hitters, maybe Andre Ethier to some degree, who are really having out-of-character seasons. And in fact, they've got a bunch of guys, some guys who are playing worse than they should. Juan Uribe's been dreadful at third base. D. Gordon's been awful at shortstop, at least with the bat. And then they have a bunch of guys who are just sort of doing what we would expect them to do. Loney's been okay. Ellis has been okay. Mark Ellis. A.J. Ellis has been a little out of character, at least with all the walks. But I don't see anything untoward there, particularly, aside from Kemp. Clayton Kershaw's having a Cy Young-type season. Chad Billingsley's pitched well. Ted Lilly been really good in 2 starts, but it's only 2 starts. Aaron Harang and Chris Capuano have not been good. So I would say they're not going to win 75% of their games, but I think that this team could be basically for real. I'm not quite as sold on the Nationals. I think we have to give some credence to the Davey Johnson factor. Davey Johnson has been a great manager basically wherever he's been. It didn't really show up last year, but maybe this is the year. Maybe like Showalter, he just needed some more time to show what he could do to put his team together. What would concern me as a fan of the Nationals is that their starting pitching has been, it's been impossible, basically, all of their pitching. They've given up 3 home runs all season. 3 home runs. I'm going to repeat that. all season, which is in 16 games, which is clearly unsustainable. Strasburg's been fantastic. 1.08 ERA. As much as I loved him coming in, 1.08 is not something that he can continue to do. Jordan Zimmerman, 1.29. Gio Gonzalez, 2.04. Ross Detweiler, 0.56 ERA in 3 starts. I just see a team that, look, it won't be shocking if all those guys are good this season. They have the talent. People have thought, had positive feelings about all those guys as prospects, but they've just been unbelievably brilliant, and they can't continue to do that. I'm not sure the offense is going to pick up when those guys necessarily fall back, but that doesn't mean they can't be competitive. I think they could be competitive and could be in the running, could be competitive all season for a wild card or even the division title. I just think the Dodgers are maybe a little bit more likely to be good and to be competitive. And I think it helps that the Dodgers play in an easier division, although, of course, both clubs have 2 wild cards available. But I like the Dodgers just a little bit more, at least until Bryce Harper comes up and explodes. And I don't think that's going to happen this season. That's all the time I have today. Again, this is Rob's Mailbag on SB Nation's YouTube channel. And please send your questions in for next week's episode. Again, the email address is robsmailbag@sbnation.com. Thanks a lot.